All right. Well, thank you for joining us for today's presentation on the community reinforcement approach. I am Tom Williams, the community outreach representative for Red Oak Recovery, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's presenters, Marcus Shoemate and Shane Phillips. Marcus Shoemate is the clinical outreach representative for Greenhill Recovery in Raleigh, North Carolina. He has functioned in various clinical roles and provided individual therapy, family counseling, group counseling, and supervised the professional development of staff. Throughout his career, Marcus has cultivated various relationships between treatment systems towards coordinating care for individuals. Through that process, he has developed a passion for linking systems of care in order to provide the best care. Marcus holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Gardner-Webb University and a master's degree in mental health counseling from Gardner-Webb University. Marcus has previously worked in residential substance abuse treatment at Pavilion. He began as a continuing care coordinator, transitioned to a primary therapist in various programs at Pavilion, and then developed and implemented the Young Men's program at Pavilion. He led the implementation and development of clinical programming and curriculum and provided clinical services in addition to supervising and managing clinical staff. Next, we have Shane Phillips. He is the executive director at Red Oak Recovery's Young Adult Men's program. Shane is a founding member of the Red Oak team and helped Red Oak open its doors in 2014. He is passionate about working with young adults and their families. Shane has worked in a variety of treatment settings, serving adolescents and young adults with co-occurring substance use and mental health disorders. Most recently, he worked as a clinician in an outpatient program at Duke University Medical Center. While getting his MSW at UNC Chapel Hill, Shane was a recipient of the Governor's Institute Scholarship. He received a fellowship through the NAADAC National Minority Fellowship Program for Addiction Counselors. He was a member of the collegiate recovery community at UNC and served for a year as the president of the Carolina Recovery Group. After completing his master's program, Shane supervised the development of a grant-funded initiative to provide peer support services to overdose survivors in Wake County. After our workshop is completed, we'll have a brief Q&A. Please drop any questions in the Zoom chat window as we move through today's presentation, and we will address them at the end. We will also be emailing a survey link to all of today's participants to evaluate today's presentation. Once you've completed your evaluation, we will then issue CE certificates to the email address you used to participate in today's workshop. We please ask that you keep muted during the presentation. And without any further ado, I welcome Marcus and Shane. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for that intro, Tom. I've never heard my resume read back to me, and it sounds way more impressive than it actually is. Sounds like I wrote that or something, maybe.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah. So first off, thanks everyone for being here. It dawned on me today that we're almost a year into virtual platforms and Zoom stuff. So I'm sure we're all is pretty fatigued from this. So we feel pretty honored to have this turnout and everybody to show up. So thank you for that. And we'll try to be good stewards of your time. So this is a modality that I know Shane and me for years have been particularly interested in and bounced research articles back and forth between. And I know in various capacities, we've tried to implement different aspects of this in our own clinical practices. And it's largely one of the reasons I joined Greenhill's team, as I thought that they had done an amazing job implementing it as an approach. So what we're going to start off with is I'll kind of give you a broad overview of what community reinforcement approach is, and then we can kind of build off of that, and we'll get it going. So my sort of theoretical orientation has always been something a little more, I've been far more interested in behavior than the emotions or the content underneath behavior. So really, when you think of community reinforcement approach, what you're kind of seeing is some sort of intersection between behaviorism, which has largely fallen out of favor for probably good and bad reasons. But you're seeing a large, like sort of think of it as a Venn diagram of behaviorism and then motivational interviewing, and then community reinforcement approach sits right there in the center of it, which makes it a particularly effective treatment modality. In fact, it's actually probably one of the better researched and validated modalities for working with substance use disorders, and yet not a whole lot of people utilize it. So this part of Shane and mine passion with bringing this to you folks today is to be able to look at this and take a hopefully to spur some interest and further research in it. So what I will say is that there's a tremendous amount of research behind this. It can get super in the weeds and weird and fun, and I love to get weird and fun. So feel free to reach out afterwards, and we can help turn you on to some stuff. But one of the things I want you to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at this is listen for the language of behaviorism. So you'll hear language like reinforcement and things like that. So what you can start to think about is like your Psych 180 class that hopefully you didn't fall asleep through on a Tuesday morning at 8:15. And then the other piece with this too, and one of the reasons it really makes sense for us to do this with Red Oak is because CRA is a modality that's really ontologically maps onto substance use disorders really well. Because it takes this long chronic view of it, and someone can kind of move up and down levels of care relative to it, all the while making sort of steady progress. So it's not this acute model that happens once and then someone's off and then they're back. It's this long-term continuum of care. And with that, I'm going to set Shane up for his slide.
Thanks, Marcus, and thank you all for being here. Tom, if you could actually go back to the recovery-oriented systems of care slide for me. I'm going to be talking about that. The one thing I'd add to what Marcus said just about CRA in the context of young adult treatment, most young adults are still working with an adolescent brain, which means they've got a gas pedal and not much of a brake pedal. And so like this idea of reinforcers, rewards being especially potent for young adults fits with why we're talking about this, why we use it in our practice and in our programs. But I'm going to talk a little bit here about how to think of CRA in the context of recovery-oriented systems of care. I'm not going to read through these bullets, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with ROSC. But, the most useful way to think about community reinforcement approach is as a part of recovery-oriented systems of care. If you're not familiar with it, it came out of an early 2000s collaboration with policymakers, prevention and treatment professionals, families and individuals impacted by substance use disorders. And a working definition that they have is a recovery-oriented system of care is a coordinated network of community-based services and supports that is person-centered and builds on the strengths and resiliencies of individuals, families, and communities to achieve abstinence and improved health, wellness, and quality of life for those with or at risk of alcohol and drug problems. So the elements of that definition specific to, really pertinent to CRA are community-based, person-centered, builds on strengths and resilience, involves families and communities, and achieving abstinence. CRA leans really heavily on the client's ecology and their recovery capital. And so the counselor is very intentionally involving the family, helping the client get a job, helping them find social networks, recreational activities, medications, the whole ecosystem is part of the treatment of CRA. So as we go through the rest of the presentation, just consider it in the context of recovery-oriented systems of care.
Go for it, Tom. Next slide. So if you look at this, these are the core components of CRA. So this sort of makes up the whole sort of CRA modality. So we're going to cover each of these as we go through, but as you start to see this, you'll see a nice little framework that explains sort of the worldview of CRA. You'll see that it's very, very heavy on skills training and behavior. And to sort of Shane's point earlier, there's a reason that this is particularly effective for young adults. And that's because you like development, right? Like all gas, no brake. So as you look at this, you'll see that it focuses quite a bit on skills training, exposure. It pulls a lot from motivational interviewing and behaviorism, and you'll start to see that fleshed out as we go. So the next point we're going to cover is the functional analysis. Go for it, Tom. So Shane said something earlier that I really loved. The sort of ecology of is a good way of sort of thinking about this. I remember being early on in my career, and I had this client. I think I was maybe 3 or 4 months into my career, and I had this young guy sit down in front of me, and he was a heavy cocaine user. And in the course of the initial assessment, he had this amazing, this outrageous story of being chased by cartels and watching people have heads cut off and all of this outrageous stuff that just didn't possibly sound real. And I was sucked into the narrative of the story. I was lost in it and lost in the emotions of it. And during a supervision session, I had a supervisor point that out, that I was providing very little in data, and it wasn't actually helpful for anyone on the treatment team because no one can make sense of it, because it was just a lot of story with a lot of emotional narrative that I had got caught up in and I was conveying. And he said, "You're lost in the narrative." And so I think that's something that happens to a lot of clinicians as we work with people with substance use disorders. We get lost in the narrative very, very easily because it's sensational. It's sort of designed to grab our attention and pull us into this. And especially as starting off as an early clinician, I couldn't see my way out of the storm or out of the story, and it was a good one. So why would I want to, right? I wanted to stay right there with the guy. But functional analysis sort of pulls the lens back a little bit, and it starts to look at the ecosystem of substance use. So again, this starts to flesh out a little bit of what we're looking at with CRA, in that it doesn't view substance use as a deer in headlights, right? Very often we become a deer in the headlights for the substance use because it's the most pronounced thing, right? But we miss the actual ecosystem. We miss how things are interplaying and working with each other to cultivate substance use issues. So a functional analysis, in this sort of part of the process, the therapist helps the client develop and identify the framework in which substance use occurs. So this can mean family, this can mean school, this can mean triggers, this can mean all these sort of things, right? And so what it starts to look at is what precipitates the substance use, because it's very rare that the substance use is happening sort of organically. There's a deterministic quality that's happening with substance use. Usually something sets it off, right? Very often, most human behavior seems to be steered by stimuli that's surrounding us that we're not entirely conscious of, but yet we're still beholden to and responsive to. So functional analysis is a really, really phenomenal tool for clinicians starting off, or at any stage of their career, really, to start to examine the framework that substance use is happening and where the problems are happening. So it really starts with that. There's people, places, times, starts to look at internal stimuli. What are the thoughts and feelings that are happening? And then it starts to create, this is where some of that MI, motivational interviewing stuff, starts to come in. You start to use the client's own words to figure out what are the consequences of the use? What are they getting out of it? And that's a question a lot of times we miss. We don't think in terms of what is it the client's getting out of their substance use. Well, that's part of the equation, and that's part of the bargain, right? If they're ultimately going to be moving towards sobriety, you're asking them to give something up. And if you don't have context for what it is that you're asking them to give up, you're really playing behind an 8-ball. So what you start to do is elicit that content from the client. What you're looking for, what is it that they like about their substance use? And that's always a fun question to ask a young guy who's been shanghaied by mom and dad into treatment and they don't want to be there, is to have the conversation of why is it that, what do they dig about their substance use? But then you also start asking, what are the negatives? What are the fallouts from that? And what you're starting to do is create and plant a seed of natural tension for change. And I think Shane was going to speak to some of another element of functional analysis.
Yeah, one thing CRA considers to be one of its more important contributions to the field at this point many years ago was to add a functional analysis, not just of drinking behaviors, but of non-drinking behaviors. And, identifying what the positive triggers are for the client's non-drinking behaviors to hopefully demonstrate to the person that they already take pleasure in activities that don't involve drinking or using, and that there's a number of positive benefits associated with that. You could, of course, have someone with kind of a later stage illness who does nothing but substance use. But more than likely with young people, you're going to have clients who are still engaging in pleasurable activities in their lives, and they can understand those in the context of a functional analysis, this time with like short-term negative consequences and long-term positive consequences. And, the classic example of no one wants to run, but everyone likes the feeling of having just been on a run, and like start to introduce the idea of some delayed gratification. So all that is part of the initial functional analysis along with the drinking behavior. That would, CRA would consider that some of the assessment. The next tool they use is the slide sobriety sampling. And as you can see, the idea here is to negotiate for a time limited period of sobriety. And so if you're working with young adults who are especially ambivalent or maybe got coerced into treatment, or the university has coerced them into some counseling, they're often not just excited about lifelong abstinence. I've worked with some young adult men who would probably rather consider castration than lifelong abstinence. And it's kind of a crass thing to say, but the point of me saying it is that it's not too far from the truth, so you've got to learn to work within the client's, reality of how long they're even willing to consider sobriety. So this tool is used up front to do that, to kind of put the person at ease and hopefully hook the client into treatment by not overwhelming the person with rigid rules or frightening expectations. The way this goes is kind of agreeing on the period of sobriety, and then the counselor helping the client problem solve how they're actually going to achieve that. If you're able to achieve this, if you're able to get a period of sobriety, you can use it for rapport building, giving the client the opportunity to set and achieve some goals, give some time to experience the benefits of sobriety or recovery, earn trust from family members, help potentially get the school conduct system off their back or get the law off their back. So a time that's long enough to where there's still some opportunity for treatment to work, or for these environmental factors to shift just enough that the person starts to experience some benefits. The CRA text would suggest bargain down, I think sometimes I'll introduce this in the context of the continuum of care and ask people, try and negotiate treatment for the time that they're in primary care and transitional living, and not even address anything after that. But knowing that I might get, 6, 9 months or a year of someone being in that continuum, and it's plenty of time, for some of the treatment to take hold. 2 things to remember: the amount of time should feel like a challenge for the client, even if it's shorter than the clinician would like. It shouldn't feel, it should feel like a goal to be accomplished, not just something super simple to do. And then whatever time you get, you use it as an opportunity to teach the behavioral skills, avoid high-risk situations, do other skill building, get a job, get some social networks. All the elements you're going to hear about CRA, you're trying to accomplish, as quickly as possible during the period of sobriety. Tom, if you could go to the next slide on the happiness scale. So this tool will be part of treatment planning in CRA. If you think of the functional analysis, more of the assessment, this helps you with identifying the goals for treatment. Super simple, super useful tool where the client self-rates on a scale of 1 to 10 their happiness or satisfaction in different areas of life. What this scale provides, or what this tool provides, you get a pre-counseling baseline that indicates which areas of the client's life are in the most need of immediate attention. You can motivate the client by pinpointing specific areas that require change. You can use this tool repeatedly throughout treatment to help evaluate ongoing progress, and then help the client discriminate between problem areas and non-problem areas, which you can then use, to maybe like reflect what is really going well in the client's life. If they're, all or nothing thinking, saying that nothing's going well. This tool, in addition to the functional analysis, is the idea is that you can and will refer back to them throughout the course of treatment, that you're getting all this information from the client up front that you tuck away in your memory and are able to pull out, when you need to reflect back what the client's values are, or they start telling you something that's, in conflict with what they told you during the functional analysis. These are just super handy concrete tools to have on hand. And last thing I think I'll say before Marcus talks about skills training is using this over time, and like helping the person see ways in which they've made progress or are ready to move into a different area of life. When I was working in collegiate recovery, the coordinator used something very similar to this to help the person establish their goals for an academic year. So it, doesn't need to be just in primary treatment or transitional living. It's well generalizable to any context of therapy.
So before I get to my slide, I have two thoughts that are largely unrelated to any of the content Shane just talked about. One, I'd like to throw a call back to Shane referencing castration in a CEU training. And two, anybody that knows Shane and me definitely would not have put, Shane would not have gotten the odds working in his favor to be the one to use castration in the presentation. So I feel like a real professional, an adult right now, minus the V-neck t-shirt for a CEU training. But nonetheless, we'll go on. So behavioral skills training. So again, as I referenced earlier, what you see a lot with this stuff in CRA is a big emphasis on giving someone the tools that they need to actually build a meaningful life. Very often what you're coming into with someone's substance use treatment, no one's coming into treatment on the wings of angels, right? So everybody's coming into treatment because things aren't sort of going well, which is, arguably means that there's some sort of deficits in their life, right? And so by using that happiness scale, you start to really hone in on what those deficits are, and you start to link in training and skills, skill building relative to sort of elevate that quality of life. And again, this goes back into this idea that substance use is taking place in the context of an ecosystem in which like undesirable emotional states are being treated or self-medicated, right? So the idea with this too that I really, really like is this is not someone doing therapy to someone, right? So if you take it back to something like some of the older traditions or like the psychodynamic approaches, what you end up having is sort of the expert, and then you have the patient. And so the expert is engaging with the patient in a very sort of hierarchical role. And part of the problem with that is you end up in this, what some could call the expert trap. So in the CRA model, there's no expert, and you don't become the expert. You align and you join with the client, and you find out what it is that they need to make their life more reinforcing towards the good. So what you'll get into is some like basic examples of the sort of skills training. You'll see like problem solving. So one way at Greenhill that we've started tackling this problem solving stuff is getting into good executive functioning coaching, teaching someone how to decrease and minimize the distress that comes from executive functioning deficits. So for those of you that don't know, executive functioning is largely the sort of neurological skill sets that allow a person to plan, coordinate, to sort of take a future view and then set up a plan towards getting there. And again, to Shane's point about young adults, that's not something that's native to young adults and especially young men. Neurologically, that's typically that isn't where their strong suit is. It's probably the reason up until I was about 25, if anyone asked me why I was jumping off a roof, the answer was always going to be, I don't know, or it seemed like a good idea at the time. So if you're dealing with a demographic that's already going to be struggling with that, and then you're not help giving in the schools or the tools necessary to help decrease the stress that happens from the fallout of that, then you're setting them up for failure. So this is where some like problem solving strategies starts to come into play. You start to do training on that. You start to work with the client around that. Like I said, at Greenhill, we do a lot of the executive functioning training specifically for this. The other piece that you'll see with this is communication skills. And the idea behind this, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, especially as we get to the last portion where it's the family portion. But what I will say about communication skills is you're looking at how to help people get their relationship needs met in a socially adaptive way, and then how to manage all the complexities and nuance that arise from that. Very often that can be a giant deficit, especially in someone that's relatively progressed in their substance use, because there's been typically a tremendous amount of isolation that's happened, or problems that have been created or strife that's been created in their relationship. So loading them up with communication skills is a means of helping lower that overall level of distress. And then third, you'll see on here substance refusal training. So you just literally are doing like training on how, like context in which that person may be offered substances, how to manage that or deal with that, or how to refuse that. And a lot of programs that have CRA elements, and this is where I think it's actually really cool, because it separates from that traditional therapy process, and that it takes the client out into the community. And what you start to look for is helping that client identify and understand what a triggered state feels like, and then helping them real time begin to practice role refusal. And ultimately that's based in that behaviorism idea, the behaviorist idea of exposure therapy and sort of desensitization. So the idea being that as you're exposed to the stimuli that's creating the triggered state, and you learn how to sort of refuse that, and then you link that into positive affective states, what you end up with is this nice reinforcing process in which it starts to feel good to reject problematic substance use. So keep going, Tom. So job and career skills. My esteemed colleague, Shane, once said that if you want to see a guy get better, how about get him a job first? It's not a great idea to have a dude that's struggling with substance use showing up and not having anything to do, right? So I think most of us were probably alive or have seen, or even maybe still there, where there's this big push in the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s for the sort of the self-esteem movement. And the problem with that is this idea that we could just give people self-esteem, that if you treat people sort of um, in a certain way, that you can elevate and give them self-talk, and you give them all these sort of things that you can enhance their sort of feeling of esteem and how they feel about themselves. CRA would take more of it, it's sort of a different approach. It would look at how do we actually help a person do things that would feel esteemable. So for a lot of that sort of treatment planning is going to go around job and career skills and how to sort of enhance that and build that. And again, if you like to circle back to this, what you're building is this ecosystem that's not very conducive for substance use, right? If you're not working and you're not doing, and when we say working or school, we're talking about meaningful experiences. How do you help a person have a meaningful vocational experience? How do you help someone have a meaningful educational experience, whatever that may be? Because if you're not doing that, you're not giving someone a whole hell of a lot of reasons to not continue using substances. So what you'll notice here at the very end, right? Work in their school can be a source of many reinforcers. So you're creating a little micro ecosystem within the career and job sort of field, that's one sphere of a person's life, that becomes a system that starts to reinforce positive behaviors and pro-social behaviors. And it's going to be really tough to be successful at a job or school if you're returning and you're into real problematic substance use. So again, building this healthy ecosystem in which substance use really doesn't map on very well to. So you can go ahead.
I'm going to talk about the next element, which is, in addition to job counseling, doing some social and recreation counseling. And, this is very proactively reaching into the person's world and trying to get them hobbies, social networks, groups of friends to hang out with, new activities that to try or return to. The hoped for outcome here is that the client's social life and recreational activities will be satisfying to a degree that it competes with alcohol and drug use and the culture around alcohol and drug use, or the people, places, and things of alcohol and drug use. And quite simply, if a client's going to maintain positive changes, their new lifestyle has to be more rewarding than the previous lifestyle. So, this is another area where CRA speaks really poignantly to young adult treatment because developmentally, adolescents, young adults, it's super appropriate for them to be more peer oriented than oriented to the older adults in their life. So if you've done a thorough functional analysis at the beginning, you're more than likely revealing that one of the needs met by substance use is some sort of social need, or like that's the function of it. So you've got to be able to like supplant that with something that will compete and then hopefully win over the drinking and using behavior. This is why you'll see most young adult treatment programs, and we certainly do this at Red Oak, are just trying to introduce the client to so many different types of activities so they can discover some fun, like learn something new that could become a hobby. So, we have a special kind of interest in outdoor pursuits, but by the time someone's left our program, they will have backpacked, fly fished, probably rock climbed or canoed, depending on the season. And it's not just that these activities are fun and might be something that excites the person in a new way, but they also require other people typically. And so you're like building community around the new activities that the person is trying. One of my favorite things to see on campus is in the afternoons when there's some free time. Some people will be in the gym working out. Some people will be making music or in the art room or something. Other people will be playing chess. you know, there's like, I try and create an environment where there's something for everyone. So they're just like learning or getting exposed to as many different activities as possible. I know there's a couple collegiate recovery professionals on this training, and I'd say that this is something that collegiate recovery is a special, has like a special niche in treating young adults with substance use problems, is how to create this on a college campus, you know, how to do social and recreation counseling in the indigenous environment of a college campus. So, you know, when I was at UNC, people were always going to the climbing gym together, going to meetings together, going out to eat together, doing any number of things that ultimately become more rewarding. So I think the thing I'd sum that up with saying is, like, CRA, I think the best way to say it is reaches into the person's life and tries to get him a job, tries to get him some friends, tries to get him some new hobbies.
Real quick, can I hop in, Shane?
Please.
So something just dawned on me. So getting someone sort of linked into some sort of social or recreational piece or hobby inherently like forces the cultivation of a lot of micro skills and starts to bring and tie a lot of things together, right? So this it's sort of small, but like rock climbing, you're having to get a belay, or you're having to get a buddy, or you know, going to the gym, or having running partners, or that sort of stuff. So again, it starts to create this little micro ecosystem of health and well-being. For some of you that may be familiar with this, for whatever reason, this has never dawned on me to this very moment, but some of Dan Siegel's work with sort of, he's a neuroscientist that researches like happy states, like sort of what does happiness look like, and what is someone that's generally sort of abiding in a state that we could call well-being or happiness, what does that sort of look like? And he really he has this little wheel that you can go on his website and see, and it's really lame because it's they got patently obvious. It's things like, well, if someone has good relationships, if someone has hobbies, if someone has work, but one of the areas that he has on there that's interesting, that I don't think we often talk about a lot, is play. So this is one of the things that I love about CRA, is it fully leans into this notion of play and having passions and sort of developing those sort of things. So if this doesn't resonate, maybe some of Siegel's work can provide a different way or different framework too of sort of conceptualizing this demographic.
I'm going to talk about relapse prevention, and then Marcus will be talking more about the family elements of CRA. The relapse prevention counseling in CRA begins with the original functional analysis. So from that, you are aware of the high-risk situations that the client might face. You know, you're using that initial tool to identify what the client's ongoing high-risk situations are. And then you're using that to, you know, where it says practice behavioral skills. In session, you're often role-playing refusal skills or problem solving, or like coping ahead. You know, if this happens, then I'll do this. Really straight ahead CBT session stuff, but in the context of avoiding high-risk situations, or using effective coping strategies if you get into them. The CRA also teaches a functional analysis of a relapse itself. And so they call this a behavioral chain. If you know the behavioral chain analysis from DBT, it's the same exact tool, pretty much identical. And so that, you know, you get really into the minute detail on what led up to someone's, you know, relapse behavior, thoughts, emotions, body sensations, actions. You know, you identify each one in a chain. and try and find places where you could, substitute in more skillful behaviors to have avoided the relapse. I'll say this is also super helpful in residential treatment, where someone may not have had access to their, substance of choice, but a treatment interfering behavior, you can, like, a relapse behavior chain focused around a treatment interfering behavior is super useful. So there's those two skills, and then the third one, the early warning system. And that's typically going to involve the concerned other. If you're, family members in young adult cases, it might be significant other or parents. And the early warning system is obviously to identify behaviors that lead up to substance use and intervene before they happen. Oftentimes, family members are going to know best, what it looks like leading up to when someone uses, whether it's they start skipping their medications, asking for more money, their grades are slipping, whatever, you've got this plan in place where the counselor is hopefully creating it with the concerned other and the identified patient, and everyone agrees upon what the warning signals are, what the intervention will be. So again, catching things before they happen, like identifying what all the signals are that could lead up to a relapse. That's all I'll say on that. I know we're running a little short on time, so Marcus, I'll hand it to you for the family stuff.
Yeah, so I've seen a couple of good questions pop up in the chat box, and I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for that. So I'll give you a couple of quick pieces on this, and then we'll kind of blow through it. But I'm going to post in the chat box Robert Meyer. He's the person that did a lot of the research on the CRAFT portion. And CRAFT is community reinforcement approach family therapy. And the best way that I've ever heard this described, and there's actually a sort of a seminal text, let me say that too, and the text is how to get your loved ones sober without nagging or pleading. And really the idea behind the family therapy portion of CRAFT is the best I've ever had it is a supervisor said, you're basically training the family to shoot fish in a barrel. And so you can, what you start doing is you train the partner, whoever that may be. In a lot of the research, they call that the concerned significant other. And so you start training the family, start training the partner, and how to provide reinforcement for non-substance using behavior. And then to also recognize their role in the ecosystem that contributes to the person's substance use. Now, I will say that this can be offensive to a lot of people because the idea becomes, it's not about me, it's about this person. And they don't view themselves as being connected, right? They see this as sort of like a dualistic or independent thing versus a system, right? And so the way that I always used to coach families on this was, would you be happier if your son is using fewer substances and using less substances and having less chaos in their life? Well, yeah. Okay, well, then this is for you because you're connected to them and you can't sort of unbound yourself from their well-being. And so by de-emphasizing their behavior and then sort of emphasizing your role and how it is that you may be contributing or co-fostering that behavior, then what you actually start to do is give yourself some room for happiness. So again, teaching family members skills that can help them enhance their own lives. So I'll give you just sort of a great nugget that I always used to use whenever I would have a family they'd get their son into treatment in a residential setting. They would finally start to breathe a sigh of relief. I would always give them the assignment of if it was parents, planning a date night. And I would force them to sort of come back to me with what their plan was for a date night. And then how it was that they were going to actually go out and do something fun that had nothing to do with their son, whom they'd sort of understandably been ruminating over. And so the idea with this is to sort of teach people how to feel states that aren't connected to the, inherently connected to their son or loved one. Also, what I'll say for any interventionist that may be on here, it's really, really worth checking out the CRAFT model. In pretty like up against the Johnston model and other intervention strategies, the CRAFT model is sort of knocks it out of the park. And so what I posted in the chat box at Robert Meyer, you can go and look at the research. And I know there's reason to be skeptical because he's the guy helping research his own stuff. But if you look at the research methodologies, they actually sort of hold up and they've been replicable. So what's cool about that is you're not going to see CRAFT fall to like the replication crisis that has plagued a lot of social science. Like, it's been replicated by other people over and over, and they're relatively easy sort of research parameters to replicate, which gives it a lot of oomph. And again, we'll start to wrap this up, but essentially what CRAFT is doing is you're helping change this very big and very large component of the ecosystem. As a therapist, I know that it can oftentimes feel amazing to sort of have a client say that you saved my life and all this sort of stuff. And it can be a nice ego stroke, but the problem with that is it's inherently not true, right? And if you think about it, it doesn't make a bit of sense. They see a clinician 1, 2, 3 hours a week tops, maybe something crazy like that. But then they spend majority of their time with their family or their concerned significant others. They're going to spend a significant chunk with that. And so what CRAFT sort of does is it trains that person or those people or that system to create an ecosystem of sort of family work that's not really, again, it's rewarding non-using behavior. So you can go ahead, Tom. So 3 primary goals: move the loved one towards treatment. And this is why I think this sort of model takes a long view, reduce their loved one's alcohol and drug use, and simultaneously improve their own lives. So real interesting. And then we'll actually sort of wrap this up and we'll just go into the questions. But one of the things that I love about the research methods for CRAFT or CRA is they are looking for like totality of days sober, right? So I think they would do like 30, 60, 90-day cutoffs. What they would find is there was a significant improvement in number of days sober if you were just checking for and shooting for more days sober than not, if you're just sort of versus the dichotomy of sober or not. So you're looking for cumulative more days sober. And what's interesting when you compare that to other treatment modalities, what you actually end up with is CRA ends up getting more days sober, even though it's not explicitly asking or demanding that, right? It's not demanding sober or not. It's demanding how many days sober can we get. And it doesn't matter if you make it 3 days and have 2 days using, 3 days not using, 4 not using, 2, whatever. They're just sort of looking at that cumulative piece. And I think what that does for us is that forces us out of the small picture and then makes us look at the bigger picture of the context of the substance use. So Tom, you can go ahead and flash forward to the end, and we'll kind of leave it on that slide. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to the chat box and scroll back up, and then that way we can just get into the questions. And what I will say is that feel free to reach out to Shane, myself, Tom, and then we'll connect you guys to you folks to any sort of resources that may be interesting. And we're always happy to talk about this stuff, or else we wouldn't have done a CRA wouldn't have done a training on it, right? So I see from Eddie at 120, he's asked, is sobriety sampling effectively harm reduction therapy? I don't think so, but I also don't think it's in conflict with that one way or the other. But I think it is sort of a natural cousin to sort of harm reduction. One thing that I will say, and that Shane may want to speak more to this, but one of the elements of CRA is it's ultimately shooting for total sobriety and total abstinence and full recovery. But it's also, which typically is not inherently a part of like a harm reduction strategy, but it's one of the reasons that I really, really, again, I love CRA is because it has a lot of risk tolerance in it towards getting someone to that area.
Yeah, and I would just add, it's very clear in all the manuals or literature, you're not fighting or arguing with the client about this. So that in that way, I think it closely mirrors any harm reduction approach, and that the client is directing where things are going to go.
It's a really, really good question. I like that. So where can we find this happiness scale resource?
I'm going to post something in the chat that'll link to it in just a second.
Beautiful. Yeah. And so also that link that I posted for Robert Meyer's stuff, it's a treasure trove of research articles, trainings, all that sort of stuff. Ignore his mustache. It's kind of weird, but otherwise the content's good. So next question. Love pointing out the limitations of self-esteem. Thank you. I wonder how self-compassion skills in dealing with failure constructively is a part of what you do. So I think any of us are dealing with clients that are struggling and will fail because they're humans and because we've failed. And I'm sure if I go back and look at the recording of this, I'll find 100 times that I misstepped and would have changed it. So I probably won't go back and look at it so that I'll sleep easier tonight. But the thing that I like about CRA is it de-emphasizes the sort of failure and goes back into the functional analysis piece. So you really just sort of problem solving. So it shifts from sort of like feeding into an emotional narrative about failure and really sort of focuses on the context of what happened for the failure. And in that way, for me, I've always found that is a way to really lean into failure as a learning experience versus some sort of cataclysmic event. You got anything on that, Shane?
No, I just continuing to look through the questions. Someone posted a good resource about smart recovery, family and friends meetings in the triangle. The core elements of CRA, aren't we talking about, at least in part, social and emotional learning? I'm not too familiar with that, but I think, yes, I think it's really similar to many other cognitive behavioral therapy treatments or, educational models. The thing that, it does nicely is just all of it is geared towards substance use and people with substance use problems. So it'll, everything you'll get with CRA will be in that context.
Yeah, so noted, if anybody wants to notice, Peter posted with an offer to help out with the Smart Recovery Family and Friends meeting. So it's a pretty cool offer there. And then Luis chimed in with a nice one. Similar to growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Yeah, I mean, totally agree, right? So it's this idea, and this is where I can get really weird with this, and one of the reasons that I love CRA stuff, and I'm totally fine to connect offline on this, but I think of humans as sort of dynamic systems. We're not these sort of, so like dualistic fixed thing that's never shifting. We're always in flux, and the sort of way that I conceptualize humans and sort of the feeling of self is that it's all prior experience intersecting with present stimuli, and what you're getting at that intersection is that experience of self. And so the problem with that is most of our clinical modalities are made to sort of cut into something, and it's this idea that we're going to target and tackle and try to go after the problem, which is often what we're thinking about the client as the problem, versus the client is a whole ecosystem in and of themselves that's being influenced by everything around them and is always in flux and always in growth. And so to sort of take this fixed mindset that's not going to constantly be reevaluating growth and remeasuring goals and shooting for new outcomes, you're not going to get good. You're not going to get good outcomes, and it doesn't map onto the experience of being a human being. So I love that, Luis. That's really, really good. And I totally agree. Let's see.
I think we've answered the questions that have come in thus far. One thing I'd like to read before we end, and feel free to ask more questions, certainly. Marcus and I can stay on. But the common mistakes made when implementing CRA, I want to read this list because it gives you kind of an insight into how to think about what's really important. So the most common mistakes made are losing sight of the client's reinforcers, failing to involve concerned others in treatment, neglecting to emphasize the importance of having a satisfying social life, not stressing the necessity of having a meaningful job, inadequately monitoring the client's contact with triggers, not checking for generalizability of skills, and being reluctant to suggest the use of disulfiram. So if you go into, if you look more into the literature, you'll see a huge part of CRA as it developed was use of disulfiram or antabuse, and super helpful stuff that you can think of in connection with other medications that are more commonly used now. So that's my final word. If there aren't any other questions.
One thing I just want to, I'll say, Shane, this isn't maybe the best nomenclature, but my initial clinical supervisor was a weirdo that did rat lab for his master's, right? So they would train, just dropping treats and getting rats to do sort of whatever. And that was my first exposure to CRA. And he had this axiom that was really, really good for helping to sort of contextualize and understand clients. And so you'll have to excuse his parlance, but it was the rat picks the reinforcer. And so this idea is that does a rat like M&Ms? I don't know. You have to see if it likes M&Ms and if it will do stuff to get more M&Ms. And if it doesn't mean the rat's defective. It means you chose poorly. So the role of the CRA clinician is to figure out what the hell it is that the client actually wants and then to help them get it. They're telling you their reinforcers and then you're figuring it out as you go. So, yeah. Never lose sight of the reinforcers.
Thank you, Marcus and Shane, and thank you all for spending the day with us. We will be, again, emailing out a survey. We would love to hear your thoughts on today's presentation, and that survey will also act as a sign-in sheet for you all. So once we get that back and that evaluation complete, we will then be issuing out all CE certificates. If you have any questions, just let me know in that email that I'll be sending out after today's presentation. But again, thank you all for spending the day with us, and thank you, Marcus and Shane.
Excellent. I'll reach out with you too anytime.
Thank you.
All right,
everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.